In the great game of geopolitics, enemies can become allies overnight, and the fiercest of rivals can suddenly find themselves sitting at the same table. The question is never about friendship or loyalty. It is about survival. And when survival is at stake, even the most unlikely partners are forced to reconsider how long they can afford to remain divided. In the realm of international politics, it is often said that there are no permanent friends or enemies, only permanent interests. This reality is starkly evident when observing how nations shift their alliances and rivalries according to the needs of the moment. Sentiment culture, or even shared history, rarely provide the true foundation of foreign policy. Instead, what binds or separates states is their calculation of what they stand to gain or lose. A nation may speak of loyalty or brotherhood in its rhetoric, but when the tide of interest turns, even long-standing partnerships can fracture overnight. Conversely, adversaries with decades of hostility can find common ground if their survival or prosperity depends on it. Such is the nature of geopolitics, where pragmatism triumphs over idealism and hard realities dictate the course of action. The reason interests carry such weight is because states operate in an environment of constant insecurity. Unlike individuals, they cannot rely on goodwill to ensure their safety. They must always anticipate threats and opportunities. This insecurity forces them to act in ways that prioritize national security, economic growth, and political influence. Where two countries see overlapping goals, cooperation becomes not only possible, but necessary. But when those goals diverge or appear to undermine each other, even neighbors tied by religion, culture, or geography can descend into suspicion and hostility. The transformation of relationships in such contexts is not about betrayal of trust, but about recalibration of needs. Nations rarely abandon principles. Rather, they interpret those principles through the lens of survival and gain. This fluidity of relationships means that no conflict is truly permanent and no alliance immune to rupture. History is full of examples where sworn enemies became indispensable partners once the balance of power shifted. Wars have been fought only to give way to trade agreements. Leaders who once hurled accusations at each other have stood side by side at summits when the circumstances demanded it. The shifting sands of interest create these paradoxes, and what seems unthinkable in one decade becomes inevitable in the next. For observers, this might appear as hypocrisy or inconsistency, but for policymakers, it is simply the recognition that interests define the boundaries of possibility. When interests align, bridges rise from the rubble of distrust. When they clash, even the strongest ties unravel with alarming speed. The challenge is not to expect loyalty, but to anticipate the direction in which the winds of necessity will blow and how quickly those winds can reshape the landscape of alliances and enmities. The relationship between the two sides has always been fragile, marked by moments of cooperation followed by periods of tension that expose the underlying mistrust. Decades of history show that they were never bound by unconditional loyalty, but rather by shared circumstances that occasionally demanded partnership. When their interests converged, they acted as close allies, providing support and coordination in matters of security, trade, and politics. Yet, whenever those interests diverged, suspicion quickly overshadowed goodwill, and the rhetoric of brotherhood gave way to accusations. This pattern has repeated itself so frequently that it has become almost predictable, leaving both societies uncertain about whether their neighbor is truly a partner or merely a temporary associate. The erosion of trust has been most evident in the realm of security. One side accuses the other of harboring militants who cross borders to carry out deadly attacks, while the other rejects these claims and views them as scapegoating for internal failures. Such accusations strike at the very heart of the relationship, because no state can feel secure if it believes its neighbor is providing sanctuary to forces determined to destabilize it. This persistent charge has created an atmosphere of constant suspicion where even small incidents become magnified as evidence of betrayal. Over time, the cycle of attack, denial, and retaliation has eroded whatever goodwill once existed, making reconciliation harder each time the issue resurfaces. Beyond security, the feeling of betrayal has extended into political and economic interactions. Diplomatic engagements often begin with promises of mutual respect and cooperation, but they are quickly undermined by the perception that one side does not treat the other as an equal. This sense of being pressured or disregarded has fueled resentment, particularly when policies are seen as attempts to dictate terms rather than build genuine partnership. Each broken promise or unmet commitment reinforces the narrative that trust cannot be rebuilt, because every step forward is followed by 2 steps back. The swings between partnership and hostility are not just diplomatic maneuvers, they have consequences for ordinary people who live along the shared border and depend on cross-border trade, travel, and cultural ties. For them, the unpredictability of the relationship means livelihoods are constantly at risk, with border closures and restrictions disrupting daily life. This instability highlights that the fragile nature of the relationship is not confined to government halls, but spills into markets, villages, and households, reminding everyone that the bond between the 2 sides remains as uncertain as ever. When tensions rise beyond a point where dialogue between neighbors becomes unworkable, the entrance of a third actor often changes the dynamics. Unlike those directly entangled in grievances, this outside power brings with it leverage rooted in influence, resources, and the ability to reshape the incentives on both sides. It does not need to appeal to sentiment or shared history, because its authority lies in the practical benefits it can offer and the risks it can mitigate. Its arrival signals that the quarrel is no longer a local matter, but one that affects broader regional stability, trade routes, and even global calculations. This presence alone can create pressure to reopen lines of communication that would otherwise remain closed. The external power in this case relies heavily on its economic weight. Massive infrastructure projects, promises of investment, and access to global markets are tools that few struggling economies can ignore. For 2 nations caught between hostility and dependence, the lure of roads, energy grids, and connectivity corridors offers a reason to reconsider animosity. When an outsider demonstrates that peace can bring tangible benefits while conflict only deepens isolation, even bitter rivals may hesitate before choosing continued confrontation. Economic leverage thus becomes not just a carrot, but also a quiet warning of what might be lost if cooperation is rejected. Beyond economics, there is also the factor of credibility. Each side, despite mistrust of one another, recognizes that this external actor has a history of delivering on its commitments and is perceived as relatively neutral in its approach. That neutrality is not born of altruism, but of self-interest, for stability in this volatile corridor is essential to protect its own borders and investments. This gives it a unique position that neither of the disputing sides can easily dismiss. Both are aware that alienating the outsider risks losing more than just a mediator. It risks losing access to one of the few partners capable of providing both financial relief and international legitimacy. Diplomacy from such a position carries more weight than ordinary negotiations. Summits hosted under the watch of this external actor come with a sense of formality and urgency that bilateral talks often lack. Its involvement raises the stakes, signaling that the time for half measures is over and that compromise must be considered seriously. For 2 neighbors accustomed to falling back into cycles of accusation and resentment, the presence of a third actor serves as both a reminder of their vulnerabilities and an opportunity to chart a different course. One of the clearest realities shaping this fragile triangle is that both sides have distinct yet overlapping needs that draw them toward external assistance. On one hand, there is the dependence on loans, infrastructure, and investment to sustain a struggling economy weighed down by debt and domestic instability. Development projects, energy grids, and connectivity routes are not luxuries, but lifelines that can prevent further collapse. Without steady flows of capital and foreign-backed infrastructure, the ability to stabilize the economy and address social pressures becomes nearly impossible. This dependence creates a willingness to listen and engage, even when mistrust with a neighbor runs deep, because refusing dialogue risks cutting off access to the very resources that are keeping the system afloat. On the other side is the search for legitimacy and recognition. For a government isolated from much of the international community, the chance to be seen at the same table as regional players and major powers is an invaluable currency. Every handshake, every summit, and every agreement signed under the watch of an influential mediator adds weight to claims of being a responsible actor rather than a pariah. Legitimacy is not only about symbolic gestures, it opens doors to trade, diplomatic exchanges, and the possibility of securing formal ties with states that have been hesitant. For a leadership facing skepticism from abroad, being treated as a stakeholder in regional projects offers both prestige and a path to greater acceptance. Despite these differing motivations, Both share a pressing need for stability. Neither can afford the consequences of unending conflict spilling across borders, draining resources, and inviting external pressure. Markets need predictability, investors demand security, and populations seek relief from the uncertainty that constant hostility generates. Stability becomes not just a strategic aim, but a survival imperative. Trade routes that remain blocked or border posts that remain shut harm both societies. And while the grievances may differ, the cost of confrontation weighs heavily on each side. These shared needs, economic lifelines for one, legitimacy for the other, and stability for both, are what provide a foundation for renewed dialogue. They highlight that beyond rhetoric, there are practical reasons why cooperation, however fragile, cannot be ignored. In an environment where mistrust runs deep, necessity can often achieve what goodwill cannot, pushing adversaries to find common ground under the shadow of mutual dependence. The deepest obstacle to any reconciliation lies in the unresolved security question, a problem that neither side can afford to ignore. Decades of violence, insurgencies, and cross-border attacks have built a wall of suspicion that diplomacy alone cannot dismantle. When one side repeatedly accuses the other of allowing militant groups to operate freely from its soil, the allegation cuts directly into the heart of sovereignty and trust. For years, these accusations have formed the backbone of hostility, feeding a cycle where every act of violence becomes another piece of evidence that promises of cooperation are hollow. The other side, in turn, rejects the charges, framing them as convenient excuses to mask internal failures. This mutual blame sustains a narrative of betrayal, preventing genuine dialogue from taking root. The persistence of militancy creates a reality where even the most ambitious economic or political agreements are undermined before they begin. No road, rail, or pipeline can thrive in an environment where explosives can be planted overnight, and no trade corridor can function if attacks continue to target security forces and civilians. This instability makes outside investors hesitant, leaving projects stalled or incomplete, further intensifying frustration. The failure to address these threats convincingly ensures that each attempt at rapprochement is overshadowed by skepticism, with leaders and populations alike questioning whether peace can truly last. Moreover, the issue is not just about isolated attacks, but about networks of fighters and safe havens that operate across porous borders. These groups thrive in areas where state control is weak, exploiting terrain and local grievances to sustain themselves. Their presence transforms the dispute from a political quarrel into a question of national survival, where hesitation to act is seen as complicity. As long as these actors retain the ability to move, recruit, and strike, distrust will continue to dominate the relationship. No matter how many diplomatic overtures are made, the repeated failure to resolve this security challenge has also fueled anger among ordinary citizens who see their lives disrupted by violence, instability, and military responses. For them, the promises of friendship and cooperation ring hollow when the reality on the ground is defined by fear. This disconnect between official statements and daily life deepens cynicism, making it harder for any peace initiative to gain genuine support. Until the security dilemma is addressed in a concrete, sustained, and verifiable way, reconciliation will remain more an aspiration than an achievable reality. Incentives are the real currency of diplomacy, and in this fragile equation, they play a decisive role in pushing rivals toward reluctant cooperation. The promise of infrastructure is one such incentive, carrying with it the allure of highways, rail links, power plants, and digital connectivity that can transform entire regions. For economies struggling under the weight of unemployment, poverty, and weak institutions, these projects are not just symbolic gestures of partnership, but concrete opportunities to reshape their futures. The possibility of linking remote areas to trade hubs or securing reliable energy supplies makes cooperation difficult to ignore. Even for governments that mistrust one another, the sheer scale of potential investment becomes a magnet strong enough to challenge entrenched hostilities. Another incentive is direct financial commitment, which brings with it the prospect of loans, grants, and development programs. For states facing fiscal crises and shrinking options, the injection of capital from an external actor can be the difference between stability and collapse. Such financial lifelines carry the power to soften hardened positions, as leaders understand that without external backing, domestic unrest and economic decline could spiral out of control. The urgency of this need often pushes governments to compromise on issues that previously seemed non-negotiable, recognizing that survival depends on keeping doors to funding open. Beyond infrastructure and finance, there is the broader incentive of inclusion in global and regional trade networks. For both sides, access to markets means more than just the flow of goods. It represents prestige, legitimacy, and the chance to be seen as part of a larger economic system. Exclusion breeds isolation, but participation brings recognition, even if grudgingly granted. For a government seeking legitimacy, and for another fighting to stabilize its economy, the idea of being tied into new trade corridors and international supply chains offers the kind of validation that goes beyond mere rhetoric. Yet the most powerful incentive may not be material at all, but existential. Both sides are acutely aware of the costs of estrangement, from border skirmishes to economic suffocation. They know that isolation weakens their hand regionally and internationally, leaving them vulnerable to both internal and external pressures. The recognition that prolonged hostility endangers survival itself forces a revaluation of priorities. When survival is at stake, compromise becomes less a choice and more an inevitability, and even the most bitter rivals find themselves drawn into reluctant cooperation. Diplomacy, no matter how carefully staged, cannot stand on photo opportunities alone. The handshakes, the joint press conferences, and the smiling portraits at summits may create an image of unity, but they are not substitutes for substantive action. Leaders know well that images can be forgotten as soon as the next crisis erupts, while the deeper issues continue to fester. The core of diplomacy lies in credibility, and credibility is measured not in speeches but in the consistent follow-through of promises made. When commitments are announced but never implemented, they erode confidence rather than build it, leaving both sides more skeptical than before. This cycle of declarations without results has been a hallmark of the relationship, reinforcing the perception that dialogue is little more than a performance staged for international audiences. The limitations of this kind of diplomacy are felt most acutely when security concerns remain unaddressed. If attacks continue across borders and insurgents operate with impunity, no amount of dialogue can change the underlying distrust. Each new incident becomes proof that the talks are empty, that words do not match actions, and that trust has once again been misplaced. For one side, the persistence of violence is taken as evidence of complicity. For the other, the constant accusations feel like pressure and humiliation. This mismatch ensures that without real measures on the ground, diplomacy risks becoming a hollow ritual rather than a genuine process of reconciliation. Economic projects face a similar challenge. Agreements to build roads or expand trade routes create headlines, but they stall when insecurity makes them unfeasible. Investors hesitate, workers fear for their lives, and the vision of prosperity fades into another unfulfilled promise. Without the ability to ensure safety, the ambitious blueprints for cooperation remain only paper documents. This breeds frustration not just among governments, but among ordinary citizens, who begin to see every announcement as a mirage. Once disillusionment sets in, it becomes harder to revive hope, no matter how significant future commitments may be. The weakness of diplomacy without action is that it undermines its own foundations. Dialogue becomes predictable theater, where expectations are raised only to be disappointed. Each failure to deliver deepens mistrust, making future efforts even more difficult. The pattern of summitry, followed by inaction, has created an atmosphere where both sides doubt whether genuine change is possible at all, leaving them trapped between the appearance of engagement and the reality of continued hostility. Hope for reconciliation rests not on lofty declarations, but on tangible conditions that can alter the course of the relationship. The first and most crucial of these is a decline in violence. If insurgent attacks are reduced and border tensions eased, even temporarily, space opens up for dialogue to flourish. Stability on the ground provides breathing room for leaders to make political choices without being accused of weakness. It also reassures populations that cooperation is not just an elite project, but something that can directly affect their safety. A calmer security environment allows economic projects to move forward, creating visible proof that peace brings real rewards. Without this reduction in violence, every attempt at friendship collapses under the weight of suspicion. The second condition is the steady flow of trade. Economic interdependence can achieve what speeches cannot because it ties the fortunes of both sides to the success of shared ventures. When goods cross borders, when businesses profit, and when workers see tangible benefits, the incentive to maintain stability grows stronger. trade becomes not only an engine of prosperity, but a stabilizer of politics, ensuring that hostility carries a measurable cost. For societies that have suffered from repeated disruptions, the continuity of commerce can transform skepticism into cautious trust. This transformation is gradual but essential because it roots diplomacy in everyday realities rather than abstract commitments. Equally important is the need for promises to be honored consistently over time. Too often, agreements have been announced with great fanfare only to dissolve in silence when difficulties emerged. This pattern has left both sides weary of expecting too much, creating a culture of cynicism where every pledge is doubted in advance. Breaking this cycle requires sustained follow-through, small but concrete steps that demonstrate reliability. Whether it is keeping border crossings open, facilitating investment, or coordinating on security, the value lies not in scale but in consistency. Each fulfilled promise lays another brick in the fragile foundation of trust. These conditions, less violence, active trade, and kept promises, do not guarantee lasting reconciliation, but they provide the minimum framework without which friendship is impossible. They serve as the benchmarks by which progress can be measured and the obstacles by which failure can be explained. If these conditions are met, even partially, the relationship can move beyond empty gestures and begin to take on the shape of something more durable. Friendship in this context cannot be romanticized as the product of goodwill or shared values, because both have proven insufficient to overcome the weight of history and the persistence of grievances. Instead, what is most likely to bring two adversaries closer is necessity itself, a recognition that neither can afford the costs of endless hostility. Pragmatism becomes the guiding principle, forcing leaders to look beyond emotions and rhetoric toward the hard realities of survival. In international politics, necessity often functions as the most effective motivator, reshaping priorities and compelling rivals to find ways of coexisting even when mutual affection is absent. What appears to the outside world as reconciliation is often no more than a calculated choice to endure together rather than risk collapsing alone. The pressure of survival manifests in different ways for each side. For one, economic strain, political instability, and mounting social discontent create a situation where external support is not optional but critical. Isolation would deepen the crisis, while access to investment and connectivity projects offers a lifeline. For the other, legitimacy remains elusive, and without recognition or inclusion in regional initiatives, it risks being locked out of the networks that could secure its future. In both cases, the alternative to cooperation is bleak, a future marked by further isolation, instability, and vulnerability to external manipulation. Necessity pushes them to reevaluate their grievances, not because they are resolved, but because they are outweighed by the urgency of survival. Pragmatism also demands flexibility in approach. Long-standing accusations and counter-accusations do not disappear overnight, but they may be temporarily set aside if larger benefits are within reach. Leaders may choose to manage rather than resolve their disputes, containing the conflict while pursuing areas where cooperation is possible. This selective engagement is not a sign of deep friendship, but of calculated compromise designed to preserve essential interests while postponing intractable problems. Such pragmatism can appear fragile, yet it is often more sustainable than attempts at sweeping reconciliation, precisely because it does not rely on sentiment but on necessity. Ultimately, the durability of any renewed relationship will depend less on the warmth of feelings than on the strength of incentives tied to survival. So long as both sides calculate that cooperation serves their interests better than conflict, the possibility of friendship, however reluctant or conditional, remains open. It will not emerge from trust or loyalty, but from the pragmatic logic of necessity. The path to reconciliation will not be paved with sentiment, but with necessity. Security, trade, and survival will dictate whether former partners can stand together again. If violence subsides, if promises are honored, and if both sides recognize that cooperation offers more than conflict, then the possibility of friendship, however fragile, remains alive. In the end, it is not history that decides, but the choices made today under the pressure of tomorrow.